but in a more transformative strategy, because actually if you're genuinely going to empower the most poorest and most disadvantaged women, you actually can't do it without huge transformations in the economic system. But you have to work towards that, struggle by struggle by struggle. There is no magic wand that will produce that. Elike.
Thank you very much.
Elike.
Elike.
Well, I've learned so much. I feel very humbled to speak after such powerful presentations. I don't have a lot to say. I spoke at great length in the previous workshop, and the report is there. Just a few observations on the basis of what I've heard. I've been very struck by how qualified equality has been, the bid for equality, the feminist bid for equality since the 1960s, how qualified that has been by the evidence, by the contextualization that so many of the papers have drawn our attention to. And I think that's important. I was reminded again and again of Judith Butler's essay about the French Revolution and the bid for equality, and how equality for women hasn't worked because it was never calibrated in whatever context, whatever campaign, whatever sort of form of activism we're looking at, feminist activism. It hasn't worked, or it's had mixed results because equality hasn't been calibrated with difference. And I think that is, just to sort of put a very sort of generalizing or overarching concept on the table, that I think has been a thread that has come through from so many of the papers, that any bid for equality does need to be qualified with attention to the difference of context, of status of class position that we're looking at. As a scholar of literature, I've of course had that throughout, that incredible sense of vertigo that comes from thinking, well, what can reading a novel or writing a poem possibly do in the face of these massive disparities of income and well-being and so on that we've been talking about, and that the graphs have exposed us to. So I have that sense of vertigo, but at the same time, we've been talking about new forms of thinking, different ways of imagining, new approaches, and of course reading, and whatever it is we read, it doesn't need to be sort of high literature, reading and engaging with different forms of creative writing is actually a way to generate new forms of thinking. Time and again we see this. Barbara, when you mentioned the Dalits feeling not like animals, but they feel themselves to be animal. Of course, what I was thinking about was the rush of empathy that reading Indra Sinha's book Animals, People about the Bhopal disaster brought in my own particular reading experience, but has brought to so many of the readers of that novel. It drew the world's attention again to the Bhopal disaster and to the consequences that followed for the survivors of that disaster in Bhopal. And that's just one illustration. I myself don't think, and I'm sure studies will be done into the future, I myself do not think it's an accident that Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, the series, the film series based on that, was screened at the time of, or just before, this outburst of concern about harassment and sexual abuse in the workplace that we touched on yesterday. I think I'm back to that old feminist phrase, we've heard it before at this workshop, consciousness raising. I do think that different kinds of reading, or whatever it is, including investigative journalism, is a way of raising consciousness, building empathy, and that remains absolutely central to the feminist movement, or movements in its many incarnations. and that you cannot have intersectionality without building structures of empathy and building channels of empathy. And I think that reading, for those of us who can do it, is a very, very important way of engaging that. So those were my two main points. I had also brought a very sort of polemical little piece by the journalist Hadley Friedman about this whole, shall we say, Harvey Weinstein thing, which actually it's the wrong. It's in the wrong mood. It's in the wrong frame. So I'm not going to read it. I will just draw your attention to it if you want a bit of sort of comic relief. The subtitle to it is "The Evidence is Mounting. A Man's Place is in the Home." But anyway, that's an example of something that I read in the last 24 hours that caught my eye and suggested something about consciousness raising. So those would be my main points. The thing about equality needing to be the bid for equality needed to be qualified, in particular about intersectionality, and the call for new forms of thinking about resistance.
Thank you very much. And I think this empathy thing, in a way, has come out in all four of the contributions we've had before: listening and understanding and not presuming. I think it's very important.
Yes,
The floor is yours.
I don't need much. I'm not going to reflect on the workshop because we've all reflected. I just thought I'll put to you some thoughts on what I call the headlines of our report, so that we see if it resonates. That would be a democratic way of picking up it. I thought of one title, and this title is also to reflect what I think we can do. Firstly, I want to thank Barbara for that schema. I think that was really very enabling. So beyond inequality, towards a reconstruction of political economy, beyond inequality, towards a reconstruction of political economy. On the argument that I believe in, that the political economy, theory and logic and triggers have to change if we ever hope to have any form of inequality within which gender comes in. And I even thought that from what we have presented today and other days, that we have some of it already. For example, Barbara's last slide is a perfect kind of rubric for developing a report around all that we heard. I don't have it in my mind. The slide is a picture in my mind which I think is very creative and valuable. So we start with that. The other is to think of learning from the gendered experience. That could be one. But learning from Dalits, from stigmatized groups, from gay, if we are looking at inequality, why not look at it from those who are suffering the greatest from exclusion and discrimination and so on. So Barbara always reminds us about the Dalits, and there are other stigmatized groups like the blacks and colored all over the white countries, including in India, and the gays. So we make our carpet more inclusive, not only of women, but others. So going back, there is law, there is morality, and somewhere if we could construct a report which offers creative ideas of a reconstruction of all these elements, law, political institutions, economic policy. I think we have enough ideas and anecdotes and presentations here, but that would be a thought. I just want to leave it with you, whether that offers some kind of a framework for us to pull together the report. I would love to hear critics, responses, and how you think. And if you think it has a meaning and is interesting, then we can take that from there.
Great, thank you.
In other words, let me just add one rider. It need not be focused on women and gender. It can fly out of women and gender into issues of philosophy, law, and justice, and morality.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. One of the things I wanted to think about in this last session also is where we need to do extra work specifically. If there are any, I mean, we've set ourselves agendas and we've analysed. Is there anywhere that we could usefully, either individually or collectively, think about extra work? And the other point, which has come out in a number of papers, is how do we start? We've talked about who the we are, and we've talked about whom we should start with, and so on. But the kind of engine of change, I mean, in a way, this is Oxfam's agenda, doing it all the time. But in some ways, Oxfam is so well known that it kind of disqualifies itself from being, the engine, because you're also caught in the system to some extent. But anyway, it's a thought to think about. We've got a bit of time, and I'd like to bring in other people to make comments, and then we'll wrap up in about a quarter of an hour as planned. But
One here.
please feel free to come in. So we'll start with Nick and Jacob, and just indicate if you'd like to come in. And Fenella.
Just in terms of engines for change, the one engine which has been alluded to but not really elaborated in great detail is that of transparency. And so much of the information that has emerged in the course of the last 48 hours is, to any reasonable and objective eye, incredibly powerful. Injustices that are unjustifiable, but are very largely unknown to huge quantities of people, not least men, but irrespective of men, just generally speaking. And we live in an age in which transparency, the combination of transparency and social media, are potentially hugely powerful agents of change. I saw it as discussed yesterday recently in the context